Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, no, thanks so much for coming along this afternoon, and thanks to Stephen for the introduction. It's yeah, like this is something that I do on the side of my main job. So I'm a data journalist at a financial trade publication in my day job. But I've for years now written about sport, both sort of in paid roles and just like in my own time on the side as a hobby on the internet. And yes, it's great to have the opportunity to talk about this with all of you. To start with, just worth giving you all a bit more background on me. So I've only been a data journalist for a couple of years, but before that, I worked as a chartered accountant for 5 years at a firm in London. So I suppose, despite being fairly new to journalism, both sides of that career change, I've spent a lot of my life with the Microsoft Excel window open on my computer. So that's sort of, where my background in data really started. And as I said at the top, I've, for the last couple of years, been working full time as a data journalist at a financial trade publication. On the sports side of things, I used to sort of write primarily about rugby, and I was a freelance contributor to Rugby Pass Plus, which was like a subscription site, like part of the website Rugby Pass, for a while. And so I did that for a bit, and since then I've branched out and I've launched my own newsletter on Substack and published that in my spare time. And to, I guess, to give you an idea of the sorts of things that I cover, over the last few months, I've written a number of pieces about the FIFA World Cup, including one about the Australia striker Sam Kerr after that great semi-final between England and Australia, and also wrote about Spain, who ended up winning during the group stages of that tournament. I've covered a bit of men's football, a bit of NBA basketball too, and as a Northern Irish sports fan, Rory McIlroy is a competitor who's travails I'm always following quite closely, and I wrote about him and his sort of skill set ahead of the Open earlier in the summer. And so yeah, that's the sort of work that I do at Plot the Ball, and it's something that I spent a fair amount of time, thinking about and trying to sort of distill the work that I'm trying to do there. And really, I've sort of landed on three different components of that work, and primarily, I'm really aiming to write clear descriptive analysis of what's happening on the field in all of the sports that I'm following. And I always hope that the written parts of the work that I'm doing would stand on their own as sort of good pieces of data journalism. But sort of secondarily, I always try and accompany those written pieces with focused data visualizations in order to augment the story. And at a slightly more abstract level, I suppose what I'm really keen to do is, publish pieces which are both insightful for people who already have a deep knowledge of that sport. So, telling someone who knows a lot about football, hopefully something new about that specific sport, but also writing it in such a way that, general sports fans are able to engage with it and, have an entry point into something new or something different. And that's, really a guiding principle for me and the work that I'm doing on Plot the Ball. I guess I've taken those three things and, come up with this tagline: using data to tell better stories about sport. And it's the tagline of the newsletter, and it's the tagline of the talk today. And hopefully over the next wee while we'll explain the way that I go about that. And it's a very personal and subjective thing, and it's the angle that I'm coming at this from. But hopefully, whether you're writing about sport or interested in communicating things with data in other in other facets of life, hopefully there's something about data storytelling, excuse me, for you to take away from this. And I think when I think about using data to tell better stories about sport, that's naturally in opposition to sort of a more conventional way. What am I saying that this is a better way than? And I think, I've spent a lot of time in my life, and I'm sure a lot of you have too, reading coverage, whether it's sort of in newspapers or online, of a number of different sports. And I think what I'm most drawn to is coverage that, talks about games and competitors on their own terms, and, avoids or, sometimes actively challenges the vaguer sort of tropes that you sometimes come across about things like confidence and momentum, which, obviously the the mental side of sport and the impact that it has on competitors is real, but the way that it's discussed and talked about, it's often pretty speculative and prone to sort of personal bias. And I think if you start from the perspective of using data, you can tell more textured and interesting stories, and stories which are actually more accurate as well. And I think, like, to sort of start this off, I think, and continue from that last point that I made, I think, like, for me, the real benefit of using data in sports writing is that it allows you to make the stories that you're telling much more precise. And I think, especially in sport, where so much data on teams and players is so freely available on the internet to, whether you're a fan or a journalist, it's pretty negligent, I think, not to make use of it, or at least, use it to shape whether or not you're a data-driven journalist, primarily, like, acknowledging it and using it to shape the stories that you're telling, I think, is really crucial to, telling accurate stories. And, like, often the types of stories that do get told about teams and players in sport are fairly binary. And, traditionally you might sort of, I'm sure everyone who's a sports fan on this webinar has, read a story about a certain team being on the rise or a certain team being on the decline, or, a piece that sort of puts two different teams or athletes in opposition to one another, with, one being presented as good and another as bad. And I think, like, for me, one of the great things about starting from a premise of going and looking at the data that's out there is that it allows you to move past that and start to think about things being positioned along a spectrum. And, instead of saying, team A is good and team B is bad, you can get into a position where you say, well, okay, well, how good is team A? Team A wins 3/4 of its matches, and team B wins, just under half. And that's immediately a more precise and, accurate description of what's going on here. And, again, if you're talking about improvement or decline, rather than saying getting better, getting worse, you can deal in specifics and say, okay, well, this team is, scoring twice as many points this year as it was last year, or conceding twice as many points this year as it was last year. And it, it moves you into, presenting things as they are in reality, which is, all of these, like, in any sport, like, these things do exist along a spectrum, and this allows you to sort of reflect that in the stories that you're telling. And I think, it's like, on a sort of slight tangent, I think when you present your evidence there and then in an article to the reader, it's also a way of establishing a level of trust between you and your audience. And, you can, the rather than a piece where, an audience is asked to sort of take what you are saying as read because you're an expert, you can, present, they can believe what you have to say because you're being transparent about the reasons why you're saying it. And I think, sometimes you get the repulse that data doesn't tell the whole story. And my response to that is always that really data is no more or less than what you as a writer or an analyst actually do with it. And, examples, like, there are, countless examples of data being used badly in a journalistic context, in the same way that there are, countless examples of, opinion-based journalism being done badly or other sorts of journalism being done badly. And I think data-driven journalism as a concept isn't undermined by those sort of specific examples. It just, like, if you think of it as one tool that you use along with your words and other components to tell good stories, and like it's that for me is the most constructive and really transparent way of thinking about it. To sort of turn this into a concrete example, like I've put on this slide, and like a line from a recent piece about the England men's rugby team, who just for those of you who aren't close followers of rugby, I think it's quite fair to say are not in great shape currently. And this is from a recent article in a national newspaper, and I've sort of highlighted the key bit that I'm getting at here in green. And this idea that England appear to be getting worse rather than better, and thinking about that in the terms that we've discussed so far, I think that very much falls into the trap of, like, okay, this is pretty binary thinking about a team and how they're performing. And how can we take that formulation, I suppose, and turn it into something more precise? And if we wanted to rewrite this in a way that is more data driven while still sort of maintaining the core idea, we could say, if you go back and look at the data that is available, you can see that both in attack and in defense, England have deteriorated since they changed head coaches at the start of this year. And not only can you say that, which is already a more precise statement than appear to be getting worse rather than getting better. As I said, in thinking about presenting your audience with that information succinctly, it's easy to say that, in a sentence, you can communicate that under their previous head coach, they were scoring about 23 points a game and conceding about 20. And under their new coach, they're scoring about 17 points per game and conceding 25. And, in a sort of similar length of paragraph or a couple of sentences, I think you can really get towards something which gives you a much clearer sense of, in this case, where England are as a rugby team, and whether or not you're, as a more data focused journalist, like I might take this and look to, look more closely at the underlying data to try and sort of expand on this story. But even if you're not a data journalist, if you're a reporter or an opinion writer, you're able to take this as a more robust and fact-based premise to start from, and you can layer the other elements of your journalism, whether that's your own opinions or quotes from sources, or like a lot of sports writing now is supplemented with clips from games or screen grabs with whatever your however you want to take this story on, like this approaching things in this way gives you a more robust premise to start from. But if you are coming at it from my perspective, or like just a more data-driven perspective, probably one of the next things that you would do is try and think about, well, how can I weave in something visual, or a chart is probably one of the other elements that you'd want to layer in on top of that data to take the story on. And I think it's worth saying, obviously there are lots of different purposes that data visualizations can be used for. And if you're in business or academia, for instance, you're coming at this from a very different point of view to my point of view as a journalist. But I think in journalism, you really are in the business of telling stories, and I think it's important to align your visualizations and the graphics that you publish as part of that, as part of those stories with that overarching goal. And on this, I guess I've tried to sort of summarize that in so many words on this slide, and like thinking about what message it is that you're trying to communicate in any written piece, is sort of a key first step. And then as you layer other elements within your piece, you can it's important to ensure that you design those other elements with the goal of communicating that core message, I think. And I think another sort of caveat that's obviously important is that when you think about communicating, or certainly when I think about communicating a message, there is the sort of underlying thrust of the message you're trying to communicate, but then there's also as a sort of secondary component, like the level of certainty that you're trying to communicate, like the strength of confidence that you have in that message. So like that for me is something that I'm always like, that is a core part of the message too. And it's crucial to always bear that in mind and bring that in based on sort of how robust you think sort of the underlying trend that you've identified, or the underlying data that you have is. And again, to sort of make this more concrete, we can look at a piece that The Athletic ran a couple of years ago about the Arsenal men's team, and it includes a visualization that I think is very effective at communicating the key message of the piece that has been written. So the title of that article is, Arsenal from bottom of the Premier League to fourth, the changes that sparked revival. So that's, it's quite clear from the outset that we're going to be looking at the story of a team that has reversed its fortunes, and the author of the piece uses the chart in a very effective way to help reinforce that message. So this is the chart that is included in the piece, and like if we think about why this particular chart is effective at reinforcing that message, so this sort of reversal of Arsenal's fortunes, immediately again at the top of the chart, you're reminded of the topic at hand in a sort of snappy sentence of 6 words. So Arsenal's climbed to the top 4. You're rather than just relying on a sort of very straightforward description of the data that's being visualized here, which is sort of relegated to the subtitle, like using something snappy and descriptive really helps focus the reader's attention on the right place. And if you've ever, John Byrne Murdoch from the FT, who obviously got a lot of attention for the COVID case and deaths charts that the Financial Times were doing during the pandemic. Like, if you ever listen to him give a presentation on data visualization, he will always mention there's some academic research that's been done that shows that the first place that a person's eyes go when they are presented with a chart is to the top and to the place where the title usually is. And that's why it's so crucially important to use that space well to, again, draw attention to what the message is. I think if you look at this chart as well in the actual body of the chart, another thing which I really think works well here is that it uses color in a really sparing and focused fashion to draw attention to what the key data point is. So in this case, Arsenal's line, which is their points total over time, it's highlighted in red, and that's obviously that sort of journey from August to March is the focus of the article. And that's given the most prominence, and that's the thing that your eye is drawn to in the first place. And then that is supported by the important context, but not as important as the sort of Arsenal line, which is the points totals of the other teams and how they progress over time. And they're grayed out and still visible and still clearly provide the context for Arsenal's rise among the other top 10 teams. So you can sort of see as they progress over time, they're clearly for the first month or two at the bottom of this grouping of teams, but you sort of see them slowly rise and rise and rise until they reach fourth place. And I think that that is one of the most like for me, if I'm thinking about using color, like not trying to tell, on this chart, for example, there are 10 separate stories that you could tell. And if you try and tell all 10 stories in one chart by, having 10 bright colors for one for each team, there's a real risk. Like your message is not going to get through as clearly as if you pare it back and say, okay, well, in this case, I want to tell the story of Arsenal, so I'm going to put the focus on them and use the rest of the data as context. And I think, as a final point, the way that the creator of this chart here has sort of used annotation to draw further attention to the most important stretches of this time series for Arsenal. So specifically the fact that they, in this case, started the season so poorly. So this is the 2021-22 season. And then again, the stretch in December as a second annotation, where they rose pretty quickly. And I think as well, like being selective in how you use annotation in that way is important, because you don't want to, and like there are lots of other things that could be drawn out of this, chart, but focusing on two stretches specifically really, like that is the heart of the message which you're trying to communicate. And again, thinking about, as I said earlier, the graphic being in support of that core message, I think annotation is used really well here. And yeah, so like on this slide, I've just got some of those key points that I've talked about. I mean, one thing that's worth saying is that I think you could even take in this example, you could even take the use of color a step further, and in both the title and the labels on the right hand side, Arsenal is presented in what, like, the club name is written in white along with the other club names, and often, like, that is something that I try and use quite frequently, as we'll get on to, and something which is seen as a good way of like further communicating those like color encodings is, if you've got a labeled data point, the name of which you've included in the title, turn that word in the title to the same color to really sort of drive home that association. And again, on the right hand side, you could turn Arsenal into the same shade of red as the line to really bring that home. But yeah, no, I think in general, I think it does these three things really well. And I suppose, again, trying to sort of thinking again about that overarching idea of using data to tell better stories about sport. Like, I try and distill that into a couple of key messages, on the one on the storytelling side and one on the sort of data and visual side. And I think, as I hopefully tried to communicate at the start, like, for me, data is essential to the storytelling process because it makes your stories more textured and precise. And that's the case whether you're a data-driven journalist accompanying them with charts and other visuals, or whether you're just using it as a you know, as a starting premise. And you know, for that reason, I think it's important not to think about storytelling without also thinking about data and what that can bring to your what that can bring to your journalism. But you know, like to sort of flip that around, I think when you're thinking about working with data as a journalist specifically, and obviously, as I said, this is, you know, differs in different contexts depending on your role and the end goal of the data that you're working with. But as a journalist, storytelling is essential to bear in mind whenever you're working with data, and it will never speak for itself or you know, stand on its own. Like, it's, as I said, it's a tool that allows you to tell good stories. And I think not thinking about data without also thinking about storytelling is like a formulation that I've sort of used to try and you know, guide my own work. And I think that's the case when you're designing charts to go with pieces that you're working on. And I suppose, like, to try and sort of bring this all together in practice, just spend a bit of time now talking about a piece that I wrote on my newsletter over the summer, just to sort of both look at how I implemented these specific sort of guiding principles, if you want to call them that, and also looking at the on a more practical side, looking at the tools and the way that I tried to bring all this together. So sort of keeping with the rugby theme from earlier, in July, I wrote a piece on Plot the Ball titled "Men's International Rugby Changed Gradually and Then Suddenly." And through that title, I was sort of hoping to communicate that this is the trend that we'll go on to discuss is something that was happening sort of continuously over time, but awareness of it, you know, only more recently came to a head. And basically, the key message of the piece is, as I've got here, that the teams who are sort of were traditionally grouped together as the Tri Nations, so Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, who've won, I think, all but one men's World Cup since that started in 1987. They've traditionally dominated men's international rugby, but the advantage that they've had over England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, who have been, you know, conventionally grouped together somewhat archaically as the home nations, and do compete for the Triple Crown between themselves in the Six Nations, and also coexist as the British and Irish Lions every 4 years. You know, the advantage that Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa have traditionally had over men's rugby and over those English-speaking teams in the Northern Hemisphere in particular has been eroded over time. And, you know, the chart that I came up with to accompany this piece was crucial in communicating the message. And that is this chart that's currently on screen. And I think, again, talking about, you know, like harking back to the example of England's current plight and sort of how you might frame that to an audience in a more data-driven way. Like, I think here I was keen to deal in a straightforward and pretty immediately understandable metric if you're a rugby fan, which is like the match scoreline. So the subtitle of the chart, which you know, summarizes what's being plotted, is it's the average scoreline in games between the second group of teams that we talked about, so England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and the first group of teams, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, since rugby went professional in at the end of 1995. And there is, you know, like average scoreline is quite a straightforward and hopefully understandable term, but there is slightly more complexity there under the surface because it's a rolling average over time, and that is something that that is a detail that I've sort of provided on the body of the chart, but it's less important to communicate than the the thrust of the story is. So it's lower in the like people sometimes talk about like the visual hierarchy of a chart, and by putting something in gray, so a non-emphatic color, and towards the bottom, you're sort of communicating that it's, you know, it's important detail, but it's not as important as the key message, which is given more prominence. And again, the talking about sort of snappy 6-word titles, like in the athletic example, like here, I've just tried to communicate the key point, which is hopefully what you can see in the body of the chart, which is the home nation. So that group of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have over time closed the gap on Australia and New Zealand and South Africa when they've played against those teams. And you know, it's clear, as you can see, the two lines on the chart sort of threaten to close quite quickly at the start of the professional era before plateauing a bit, and actually things regressed slightly around 2007. And the scorelines in games between these groups of teams got wider again, but since then it's been a fairly steady move towards the current state of affairs, which is that there's really no meaningful gap between those two groups of teams. And again, like thinking about the things that we talked about in the context of the athletic chart, like using color consistently across the title, subtitle, and the chart body to sort of like reinforce those encodings. So home nations is in red in the title, in the subtitle, in the line label to the left, and in the sort of label of the final data point to the right of the chart. And likewise, the tri-nations are like, that's in navy blue in the subtitle, the line label to the left, and the label of the final data point to the right. And you know, sometimes in a line chart you'll see sort of a key off to the side with a, you know, in this case it would show a blue line with tri-nations labeled and a red line with home nations. But I think you like putting those labels right next to the actual line of data that you're plotting is important, I think, because it keeps the viewer's eye on the main body of the chart, and that's where that's, you want people to look at that and have thoughts about that chart, and rather than sort of having your eye flip between a legend off to the side and the main body of the chart, I think, which will make that a less effective. I think it's sort of acknowledged in best practice that that's like a less effective design choice. And yeah, so as I said, sort of thinking about like how this came together, as I said at the top, my background as a chartered accountant, I like Excel and spreadsheet-based software pretty like second nature to me at this point. But I actually started this newsletter because I wanted to improve my coding in R specifically, and so a lot of all of the visualizations that I publish in the newsletter are built in R and ggplot, and in this case just because of the source of the data and the ease of obtaining it. I used Google Sheets to bring it in, and then also at the end of the process used Preview for Mac to sort of add annotations in a slightly easier way. But yeah, like the majority of the work, like 95% of the work that I do for the newsletter is done in R. But in this case, I was drawing on data from Wikipedia, which one of the things about rugby compared to other sports, and probably one of the reasons why I've moved away from writing as much about it, is that data availability is just much poorer than other sports. So for if you're looking for data on the results of test matches, pretty much to my knowledge the best source is Wikipedia, if anyone has sort of better alternatives, I'd love to know about them. But in order to pull this data out from Wikipedia, I brought it into Google Sheets using this import HTML function, which allows you to bring in HTML tables directly from web pages in quite a user-friendly way. And obviously, because Wikipedia is not the most reliable source in the world, I was sort of aware that it needed more checks than data from more verifiable sources might. And I was able to sort of cross-reference parts of the data that I collected here to a number of other databases that I'd maintained for other purposes, and also sort of did some spot checks a bit later in the process on like specific trends. So, for example, one of the things that I noted was that Scotland's defensive performance was suspiciously good just before the 2011 World Cup. So I sort of went away when I saw that line on a chart and made sure that that was backed up by the actual results and not a sort of an error in the data manipulation process. The cleaning for this I also did in Google Sheets. To be honest, that is probably because I initially did the data work quite a while ago, so sort of late last year. And if I was doing it again, I think I'd probably do the data cleaning in R just because it would make it more robust and repeatable. But I was as I said, I'm sort of fairly comfortable in spreadsheet-based software, and that was what I chose to do this in. But I brought it into R using the Google Sheets 4 package, which is really useful for interfacing between those spreadsheets that you keep in other places, and you can just sort of import those as data frames in R. And then I did some of the analysis on top of that basic data frame after I'd imported it. So the rolling average calculations are all done in R, and then created the graphic using ggplot2. And so I guess rather than going through sort of line by line the code for this particular chart, I will say that all of the code for each newsletter, including this one, is published on GitHub, and you can access that at the link that's on the screen. And so that doesn't include the annotation layer, because as I said earlier, that's something that I do in preview, and that's sort of purely for the ease of using it, and it's easy to make changes and experiment with things in a way that sort of adding text directly on to the body of charts in R I find quite fiddly. And I think this was something that I sort of was I got onto after listening to an interview with Tom Warville, who actually used to work for The Athletic, although I don't think he made that chart earlier, and now works for a professional football club as a data scientist. And he talked specifically about doing this, like making charts in ggplot2 and then adding annotations over the top in preview. And yeah, that sort of gave me the courage to do the same. And I think it's like that for me is like a good example of like just trying to be practical with the tools that I'm using rather than like necessarily being a purist. And I think I've got, like, even despite that, I've got so much out of this process of like, I guess, forcing myself to get better at R by doing all of the doing the bulk of the data work using that programming language. And again, just to cap off, there's the chart that I'm talking about, if you want to have another look. And yeah, I just wanted to say again, like, thanks so much for taking the time to come along and listen. Like, it's it's a really fun outlet for me. I love doing this. I love doing this sort of work, and it's on something that I'm really passionate about, both, as a, like, obviously as a data journalist in my day job, the process and the data elements and the design elements are something that I'm really get a lot out of, and I'm passionate about professionally. But it's also just like watching sport and reading about sport, and listening to what other people have to say about it is just like one of it's always been one of the things that I've just spent a lot of my free time doing for as long as I can remember. And like it's been great to have a chance to talk about it to you all in a bit more detail today. As I said in one of the last slides, like if you do want to sort of get into the code of behind that chart and the rest of the newsletter, all of that is available on GitHub. If you would like to sort of stay up to date with my work more generally, you can subscribe to the newsletter. That's at plottheball.com. And because this is something I'm doing around my day job, I'm not publishing on a fixed schedule. But I would say on average, you could, if you wanted to sign up, you would probably expect a couple of pieces of sort of 1,000 words or so or less every month. So it's not, something that will be bombarding your email inboxes. And yeah, it's a wide range of topics. But as I said, sort of hopefully, whether or not you're a fan of that particular sport that I'm writing about on a given day, like I try and construct them in a way so that there's something for everyone, even if you're just more of a general sports fan. And if you do want to get in contact by any other medium, like my not Twitter, my X username is on the screen there, and my email and LinkedIn too. If you'd would love to hear any or thoughts on the presentation or like any other aspects of my work. And yeah, we've finished up there about 15 minutes before the end of the scheduled time, so happy to stick around and chat or answer questions. I think Stephen's going to jump back in a second and moderate. But yeah, no, thanks so much for coming along.
Thanks very much, Ben. That was really interesting, and I find it funny that it was the Scotland rugby team's defence that got your suspicions, raised your suspicions. If anyone's got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the moment. There's a couple in here at the moment that we'll go to first. The first one is from someone who's asked anonymously. And they're asking, a lot of the time when we talk about our favourite sports down at the pub or at work, these conversations are based on feelings and emotions from people who are quite invested in their team or their favourite athletes. Can you see the average sports fan becoming more interested in data to guide these kind of day-to-day conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hopefully it came across today, but like this is something that I have come at from, like I feel like I'm starting from a place of like passion and enthusiasm for this too. And I think, I try and, when I think about like athletes or teams that I enjoy watching, I try and sort of separate that out into both like, okay, like what are they doing that I'm enjoying, and like what is it specifically that's like drawn me to this person or this team, but then also like that's sort of on one axis, and then on the other axis is like how good are they, how well are they performing, how are they doing. And I think it's important to sort of like bear those two sort of separate things in mind, because they are distinct. And I think that's not saying that like everyone should love all of the best sports teams, or conversely that like all of the teams that everyone loves are good. But I think if you sort of split it into those, like for me, splitting it into along those two sort of axes is helpful. And like you can approach you can tell interesting stories about teams or players that are at any point on that spectrum. You can, if you're a fan of, if you enjoy watching Lionel Messi play football, for example, like understanding just like how otherworldly good he is compared to everyone else, like that for me would augment my, like if that was someone who I was like hugely passionate about watching, like understanding that more fully would really, um, that I feel like that's something that would like deepen my enthusiasm and relationship with that particular athlete. And I
Just to
think,
see how much further
yeah,
ahead than
exactly.
the
And like,
average they
and
are.
obviously, like that's not the only way to appreciate someone, and those sorts of things can get weaponized by people who, like the sort of eternal like Messi versus Ronaldo debates that play out in social media. Like there are like bad sides to that too. But I think like if you are approaching it from a place of just like this is something I'm really passionate about and I want to understand it as much as I can, like all of that context is really important for like, in that context, like just how good someone is. And I think,
Yeah,
like they exist sort of and like, and again, like also just not like this isn't the way that I think about sport, or like this particular way of looking about sport like isn't for everyone, and like acknowledging that like it's not like this isn't going to make everyone's experience of this thing that they're passionate about better, but for people who are more inclined to think about other things this way, like I think it can really like deepen your understanding of something and like strengthen your attachment to it, I suppose.
cool. Nice one. We've got another question here. This is more about the something you'd mentioned earlier. Is that, do you know of good resources that explain how to arrange a data visualization? I think you mentioned using the gray zone as a hierarchy of. You mentioned a hierarchy. Do you have any?
Yes, so I mean, I would say that like there are like specifically on the things that I like, I guess thinking about those three things that a couple of the key points that I mentioned, like on the use of color, there are a lots of really good. So there's a data visualization tool called Data Wrapper, which I can drop a link to in the chat, and like they have a load of blog posts. Like this, they have someone on staff who is currently writing a book about the use of data in, or the use of color in data visualizations, and has sort of published lots of blog posts alongside that. So like the Data Wrapper website is like an amazing resource to start from, because as well as like providing a tool for people to make charts, and they talk a lot about theory and best practice. So that's a really good starting point. I talked about the Financial Times earlier. They have a tool called the visual vocabulary, which sort of approaches it from the point of view of like I sort of know what story I want to tell, what is the best chart type to use to tell that story. And yeah, if you Google FT visual vocabulary, it'll be the first thing that comes up. And that's a really helpful too. But like if there are more specific questions that anyone does have, like feel free to just like, send me a DM on Twitter or an email. And I'm happy to chat.
I would say as well in the Data Lab community, we've got a group for data visualization, and there have been quite a lot of good resources posted in there over the last few months. Some stuff around color palettes and accessibility as well. So it's worth it if you're in there having a little search through the recent posts in the group. So someone is asking, Andrew Lombard, do you have any go-to data sources for people to begin exploring open source sports data? You'd mentioned you use Wikipedia. Have you got any other
Yeah,
sources
so
you'd
I mean,
recommend?
I try not to make a habit of using Wikipedia,
Right.
but needs must in certain cases. Yeah, so I mean, especially if you're, I'll just drop a link in the chat because this is really like a really good starting point, particularly if you're working in R. Um, there is a someone has put together a can I put this in the chat? I can't put it in the chat, but anyway, there's if you
Right.
Google sports dataverse, there's like like some people who work in R have basically put together a list of lots of different um R packages that you can use to extract data from various sort of online sources for different sports. And even if you're not working in R, it should give you an idea of what data is out there and how people are getting hold of it. I think if like some of the like if you're interested in major American sports, like all of there's like the sports reference family of websites is really useful and easy to use, and they've got it so like a soccer site called FBref, which is really great for football data, which they launched a couple of years ago, so that's really good too. But yeah, that's sports dataverse for a lot of major sports sort of puts it all in one place and shows you where to go.
Thank you. And then someone's asking about your design, and they're asking, as a designer who's increasingly experimenting with creative data visualization and illustrative visualizations, do you think that these graphics would connect with readers more than rudimentary charts?
So I think, like again, I think it's like in this. I suppose everyone's sort of working in the context of their own audience and their audience's own comfort with data visualizations and sort of data-led thinking in general. Like I think because of because I'm trying to sort of publish things which are accessible to like a more like a fairly wide non-specialist audience of people who are sort of data literate and know a bit about sport. Like I try and keep things more not I was going to say simplistic, but not too complicated or overly cluttered. But I think like there are lots of not necessarily in sport, but like across a whole range of topics. There are some people out there that do incredibly ambitious and incredibly complex data visualizations of data that are much more creative and much more time intensive than the sorts of things that I'm putting out. And like the audience is there for those. So I think I think about it in terms of I think about it in those terms, like who are you trying to reach with any given chart or piece of writing that you're doing. And like I think like within a sporting context, I think the the number of people who are looking for like experimental ambitious sports data visualization is like a niche within this sort of existing niche. But like I think more broadly, like there's clearly a market for like much more ambitious stuff in general in the sort of data visualization world.
I think you just got to make sure you know who your audience is, and then you can tailor it to what they need. So Jane Harvey has asked the question here. She's asking if you know how much of your techniques are used by performance analysts. I'm assuming in kind of professional teams. Do you know if there's similarities between what you're doing?
So like I think that's a really good question. Like I think a lot of like this more analytical sort of sports coverage often comes at it from the point of view of like how people in clubs or governing bodies or national teams or whoever uses data and tries to approach from that perspective. I like to be honest, that I think there's a value in like if you think about their goals and their audience, like they are trying to improve the performance of the players or athletes under their remit. And the while there's a lot of overlap between like what performance analysts will try and do and what people in the media try and do, I think often like I think there's a gap in the market for people who want to write about sport, who want to use data from a more storytelling based perspective. So I think like it's not like, I think it can be you can certainly like, and like lots of people do write blogs and newsletters and write for major publications, very sort of fine-grained sort of performance analysis-esque pieces of writing. But I think the way that I approach it is slightly wider. And as I said, I think that's because of the audience that I'm trying to reach and like the way that I'm trying to reach them. And like the I think like a publication like The Athletic, I think is great, and like highlight some of the work that they do earlier. But like I think not every Liverpool fan necessarily needs to see the 10 screenshots of when Trent Alexander-Arnold was like 3 feet out of position at right back, you know, throughout the 2022-23. So like I think there's sometimes a risk of like going into too much detail just because you can, or because you want to sort of like show how much you do know, when like I think summarizing a story in 1,000 or so words and like accompanying it with like 1 or 2 graphs, while that might not, you know, it's not going to get you a job in a professional club, like I think it is better for connecting with your audience and like giving them something that is easy to take away.
I guess that goes back to what you said at the beginning around not thinking about the story without data and not thinking about the data without the story. There's
Yeah,
no
I think
point,
so. Yeah,
like, you know, if your story doesn't need that detail, then there's
yeah,
not necessarily a need to include it.
it's being
So we've
select.
just got time for this last question from Jane, who's just asked if you could remind the name of the, I'm guessing, Financial Times
Oh
quote.
yes, yeah. So it's the visual vocabulary. I don't know. Can I type in the
Visual
chat?
vocabulary. I don't know why you can't post in the chat, but
Yeah.
I'll post it now. Visual vocabulary.
Yep. That's the one.
Vocabulary. Okay, perfect. Cool. So that's us pretty much at the end of time. So thank you very much, Ben, and thank you everybody who's been watching. If people want to keep in touch with you, you've put your details on the screen, so I'm assuming you're happy for people to get in touch. And if
Yeah, absolutely. I like would love to hear from anyone, everyone about anything. And yeah, if you do want to, you know, keep up to date, the newsletter is the best place to find me. So yeah, plottheball.com is where you can subscribe.
great, and if anybody here is not a member of the Data Lab community, please join, and hopefully we'll see you in there and at the next event soon. Cool. Thank you.